between the Philippines and China. I thank all of you for your interest and participation in today's conference, which we in the Ateneo de Manila University hope will inspire more research about the historical relations between the two countries and foster better relations today and in the future.
Thank you very much, Father Yop. To give us an introduction to the Pre-Colonial and Colonial Philippines-China Relations History Conference, let us all welcome Dr. Ellen Palanca, Director of the Confucius Institute at the Ateneo de Manila University.
Dr. Liang Han, Chinese Director of Confucius Institute at the Ateneo de Manila University. All presenters for today's conference, all our distinguished discussants, fellow academicians, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Today is the culmination of our research project on pre-colonial and colonial Philippines-China relations. Let me introduce to you this project, which we embarked on in November of 2019. We're lucky that it was still pre-pandemic. 2017 was the 600th anniversary of the trip of Sultan Paduka Pahala, or another name is Paduka Batara of Sulu to China. Sultan Paduka, with an entourage of more than 350 people, which included his family, his officials, his followers, went to China on a tribute mission. Unfortunately, he suddenly died on his way back home. When the Chinese emperor heard about the news, he was very empathetic and gracious. He gave the Sultan a royal burial there where he died, which was in Tezo, Shandong. The tomb, together with those of his second wife and one of his sons, is still there in Tezo for anyone to visit. Many of you here who are history teachers most likely know this story. It illustrates that there existed friendly relations between the Philippines. Of course, it was not known with that name. We did not have that name yet. With the Philippines and China way before the Spaniards came. In fact, historical evidence shows that the relations, most likely trade relations, started as early as the 10th century during the Sung dynasty. To highlight this part of Philippine history, the Ateneo Confucius Institute commemorated the 600th anniversary of Sultan Paduka's trip to China with a conference on the development of Philippines-China relations, and also made a documentary film showing the past and present relations between Sulu and China. The Institute feels that we can and should do more so that Philippines-China relations history before and during colonization would not be lost. Not much has been written about these relations, students don't get to learn about it in school, as it's not in any history book used in school. We wanted history teachers to be aware of this part of Philippine history, and for those interested to do research in this area. To achieve these goals, with the help of our history department, Ateneo, we held a 2-day seminar workshop on teaching of and research on pre-colonial and colonial Philippines-China relations in November of 2019. It gathered 26 history and social sciences college-level teachers from all over the country. The seminar on the first day consisted of talks by experts, by some experts in this area. Some of the topics were enhancing history teaching with the inclusion of our relations with China, availability of materials to do this kind of research, as well as the methodology for such research, and also some evidence of relations, of such past relations using rare materials. The teachers mingled and discussed among themselves and also with experts present. Those interested to do research wrote proposals the following day, while experts were still around to give advice. We were able to get 7 proposals from 12 of the participants. Their finished works will be presented today. These scholars represented, I should say represent, they're still doing the research under their respective institutions. And starting from the north, we have a couple from the UP Baguio. We have also UP Diliman, UP Los Baños, UP Visayas, Xavier University, and Mindanao State University Iligan Institute of Technology. Another paper is by our own Chinese director, who is from Sun Yat-sen University in Guangzhou. We're very thankful to these researchers who, despite the pandemic, finished writing their papers with little delay. We thank them for their perseverance and enthusiasm. I'm sure we're all eager to listen to their presentations at this conference. I also want to thank our invited discussants who will contribute their knowledge and expertise to our project with their comments on the papers. At this point, I also would like to pay tribute to an advisor of our project, Professor Aurora Rojas Lim, who unfortunately passed away on November 16, 2020. Roxy, as she was fondly called, was one of the few scholars who for several decades braved going to Mindanao to research on the Chinese there. She was sorely missed as we continued with the project without her. Finally, I would like to announce that even as we end this phase of our research project, we plan to continue our support for this area of research. We would be happy to have proposals by scholars who are interested in working on this topic. We also encourage and welcome researchers who can read classical Chinese so that they can tap on the wealth of archival materials that are in Chinese. We believe that, as Father Bobby Yap mentioned, the knowledge produced by such research activities will promote better understanding between our country and China. Lastly, I wish to thank all for taking your precious time out to attend this conference. Mabuhay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Palanca. We will now formally begin the presentation of final papers. For this, may we invite our moderator, Mr. Chris Garcia, to introduce our presenter and discussants.
Good morning, everyone. Our first speaker is Dr. Juvanni Caballero. Dr. Caballero is Professor of History at Mindanao State University, Iligan Institute of Technology. He is concurrently the Campus Secretary and Chief of Staff of the Office of the Chancellor in the said university. He holds a PhD in History from the University of the Philippines, Diliman, Quezon City. Our discussants for this first paper are, first, Dr. Bernardita Churchill. She was a longtime faculty member of the Department of History at the University of the Philippines, with appointments as Professor of History and Chair, and later as Professorial Lecturer until retirement in 2003. She also taught at the graduate schools of De La Salle University and University of Santo Tomas. She was founding member of the Philippine Association for Chinese Studies, or PACS, and is presently the president of the Philippine National Historical Society. Our second discussant will be Dr. Patricio Abinales. He is a professor at the Department of Asian Studies, University of Hawaii, Manoa. He is a co-author of State and Society in the Philippines, published by Rowman and Littlefield and the Ateneo University Press in 2017. He completed his PhD in Government and Southeast Asian Studies at Cornell University, and his research focus is on Mindanao history. Again, we'd like to remind the speakers that we will be allotting 25 minutes for their presentation. And with that, we'd like to welcome Dr. Juvanni Caballero to present this paper.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Dr. Palanca, Dr. Liang, Dr. Churchill, and Dr. Abinales. This morning, I'm going to present a component of a bigger research on probing Chinese-Maranao relations prior to 1898. This research has three components, namely an archaeological component headed by Dr. Lee Neri of UP Diliman, an archival component headed by Dr. Faina Olindang and Professor Rina Bongkokan of Xavier University and UPLB, respectively, and an oral history component, which I am heading. So in my paper, I will be attempting to show that based on oral history of the Maranaos, there was a direct Chinese-Maranao contact before Western civilization was, quote and unquote, was force-fed to the Maranaos. Before the Americans claimed to have established peace and order in Lanao in order for outsiders to come into Lanao and settle among the Maranaos. You probably are wondering why we chose this topic and this time frame. Well, the dominant assumption as far as literature is concerned, is that it was only the Magindanaons and the Tausugs, no, through the respective sultanates, that had a direct interaction with the Chinese. In fact, Sulu and Makunchalao or Maguindanao appeared undoubtedly, no, in the Chinese records. So it would appear that the Maranaos simply stayed, no, at the background of his Maguindanao and Tausug neighbors. Knowing the entrepreneurial and the adventurous spirit of the Maranao, is it really possible for him to simply stay passive at the background of his Maguindanao and Tausug cousins? Are we satisfied with the suggestions of earlier scholars like Peter Gowing, who insinuated that prior to the subjugation of the Maranaos by the Americans, Lanao was a wild country, quite dangerous to outsiders? So these are some of the burning questions that I would like to answer in this paper. No? And as suggested in the title, oral history is the primary methodology that I employed. No? A number of key informants were initially identified as early as December 2020, most of whom were local historians, no, from Mindanao State University, anthropologists, no, like Nagasura Madali, no, and Intuas Abdullah, educators, cultural advocates and workers, descendants of Chinese residents of Marawi, and other old-time residents of the city and the neighboring municipalities of Lanao del Norte and Lanao del Sur. From this initial list, the number of oral informants snowballed to 28, no, in the course of my research. Interviews were recorded and an English translation of their highlights were printed. So, what did I discover in my research? No? Well, I discovered several things. No? Firstly, I went through the written records that are within my reach, no, and discovered that the earliest document ever written by a Spaniard that has reference to the Maranaos was the letter of Juan Ronquillo, written at the closing years of the 16th century. This letter, which is dated January 4, 1598, was actually Ronquillo's report to Governor General Antonio de Morga on his campaign against Buayan, against the Sultanate of Buayan, after his commander Esteban Rodriguez de Figueroa was killed, no, in a hand-to-hand combat. In that report, he mentioned that two of the chiefs from the Great Lake Lanao came to befriend them because of the fame of his campaign against Buayan. After this, it would take several decades before the Spanish documents would mention the Maranaos and the lake again. No? What is the implication of this? Well, the implication is that in the 16th century, and even in the 17th century, earlier part of 17th century, the Maranaos could not register well in the documents because they were a people that is largely unknown. And that is why James Warren would say, the Maranaos remained little known to the Spanish invaders, European travelers, and traders because of their upcountry agricultural orientation. They were a people beyond the pale or out of reach. No? And because they were unknown to foreigners, especially the Spaniards, no, and other Westerners, no, they are sometimes muddled up, no, with other peoples. Take, for instance, Francisco Combes, who subsumed the Maranaos under the Maguindanao or the Mindanao category, no, in his book, Historia de las Islas de Mindanao, Jolo y sus adyacentes. No? In the 9th chapter of his book, Combes mentioned that there were 4 nations in Mindanao: Caragas, the Mindanaos, the Lutaos, and the Subanos. Yet in the 10th chapter, he mentioned that Don Pedro Manuel Manoo, Spain's ally in the Pitan, conquered the village of Bayog, no, which belonged to the Malanao nations, who were subject to the Mindanaos. The same can be said to the English explorer William Dampier, no, who wrote in 1697, and he mentioned a group of people he called Ilanunes, who lived in the heart of the country. And because of this, no, Warren noted that the term Iranon or Ilanon, though it had come to be applied to all the Maguindanao Sulu raiders, no, of the late 18th century, but in Dampier's time, the term Maranao applied only to someone who was part of the encampment of the Great Lake Lanao. And in this sense, he said, many 17th century Iranon were not actually Iranon, but Maranao people of the lake. So if the Iranons were actually Maranaos, then documents bearing the term Iranon may be giving us some glimpse of what the Maranaos were doing 500 years ago, even if they did not exist in most 16th century documents. No? What's the bottom line of all this? Well, this discussion simply shows that the Maranaos, though the Maranaos are not explicitly mentioned, no, in the documents written in the 16th and earlier centuries, because of the possibility that outsiders confuse them with other peoples in Mindanao or island Southeast Asia, it does not necessarily mean they did not exist. No? After all, they are the second largest Moro group, no, in terms of population. It does not mean they simply hid, no, in their mountain lake habitat and possibly, spectating the developments outside. Because if you are going to look into the oral traditions, particularly the stories of the old folks, it would appear that there were lots of historical events, including Chinese-Maranao interactions prior to 1898, no, that our written records failed to capture. So, despite the scarcity of pre-1898 documents that would give us information about Chinese-Maranao interaction, we are still able to find some cracks, no, in the parchment curtain, so to speak. Take, for instance, the court proceedings of captured Iranon marauders in 1838, no? Which mentioned that half of the members of the Ilanon crew or the Iranon crew put on trial in Singapore in that year were either Bisayan, Sulawesi, Tagalogs, Bugis, Tubilio, and even Chinese. So in other words, the Chinese had been interacting already with the Iranons, no, or Iranon/Maranao, no, as early as 1838. That's 60 years, no, earlier than more than 60 years earlier than the supposed, establishment of peace and order in Lanao, no, by the Americans. Interestingly, this piece of written evidence is corroborated by, several stories, no, particularly that of Dato Paisal Pangandaman, no, who is a 73 member of the community elders, no, in the town of Ditsaan Ramain. And he said, no, I remember old stories telling us that there were Chinese in Lanao, and those Chinese who arrived there were pirates, he said. And these pirates found their way to Lanao and settled among us even before the arrival of the Arabs. So these are the stories he remembered, no, being told to them by their grandfathers. Okay. Another written record that gives us an idea of Chinese-Maranao relations prior to 1898 is the diary of Mr. C. Hokian, a Chinese businessman who came to Iligan in the early 1890s. I found a published excerpt of his diary at the library of the Lanao Chunghwa School, our local Chinese school here in Iligan. No? And I was amazed because as early as 1890s, he settled here in Iligan and engaged in the lumber business for the Cebu market. And interestingly, he mentioned there in his diary that he was hiring Moros to cut down the lumber, no? To cut down the trees, to go to the forest and harvest the lumber. No? Take note that Iligan then was just a small garrison town. Outside of the garrison, the Spaniards had no control. In fact, it was the Higaonons and the Maranaos that controlled who controlled the surrounding mountains and forests, no? And if the Chinese were not friends with the Maranaos, there could be no lumber business for Mr. C. Hokkien, no? And more so, no people, no laborers to cut down the lumber. The intelligence reports of the Americans at the turn of the 20th century also give us an idea or an insight on Chinese-Maranao relations, no? Carter Bentley noted that even in the second half of the 19th century, which saw the disintegration of Muslim power elsewhere in Mindanao, found the Lanao Muslims and Spaniards still facing off a short distance inland, no, from the Iligan coast, no? And yet, despite the belligerent relations, there was still interaction between the two, between the Spaniards and the Christian allies here in Iligan and the interior parts of Alanao. And he said, and this interaction takes the form of trade, usually facilitated by the Chinese. The implication of this information is that the Chinese must have been accepted and trusted by both camps, and that the most viable explanation of the trust and acceptance is that the natives must have been familiar already with the Chinese, because even before the coming of the Spaniards, and as claimed by our informants, even before the coming of Islam, the Chinese were already a familiar figure in Lanao. Take note that getting the trust and confidence of people does not happen overnight. How long have the Chinese been present in Lanao, directly interacting with the Chinese? My key informants, of course, could not provide a definite answer, but the information they shared are very insightful, no? So I had several questions, because the dominant assumption was that, you know, the Chinese were only able to reside in Lanao after the Americans established peace and order, no, in the Lake Lanao region. So I asked them if was it really possible for the Chinese? Lanao was said to be a very dangerous place for outsiders, and so on and so forth. So I pursued these questions, no? I pursued these questions, and the comments of my key informants, I thought, are very insightful, no? Like, for instance, the comment of Ali Makabalang, which said, if it was true that our ancestors were lawless, uncivilized, and hostile to outsiders, how come Islam came to our communities? Islam is also an imported religion brought to us by outsiders. Were the pioneering Arabs and other Muslim converts who brought Islam to our communities not foreigners when they first arrived to our shores? Islamic civilization was a later development compared to that of the Chinese. And so it is logical to believe that the latter was even here way ahead of the former. And another key informant was saying, if the Maranos strongly, because I was trying to challenge their claim, no? That the Maranaos were friendly, and one informant, Dr. De Ampuan, for instance, said, if the Maranaos strongly resisted the Spaniards and the Americans, it was because they were antagonistic groups of people. They came to conquer Lanao, and so it was natural for our ancestors not to welcome them and show them how fierce we can be. But mind you, Maranao culture was and is very warm and hospitable to worthy. She really emphasized the word to worthy outsiders. And by the term worthy, I mean people who came with non-aggressive stance or antagonistic reasons. Missionaries and traders were among those who were welcomed by our ancestors. No? So, and another comment was from a key informant. She's an associate professor of history at the Mindanao State University, who had been studying about Chinese ceramics, no? I mean, the collections of Chinese ceramic collections, no, of Maranao families. And she said, as far as I can remember, the Chinese were like a natural part of our history. In fact, she said, we have a Maranao term for the Chinese. We call them lanang. So the Maranaos also call them lanang. And she said if the Chinese only came to Lanao with the Americans in the first decade of the 20th century, such Maranao term would not have been in our vocabulary. We could have adopted the English word Chinese or the popular Filipino word inche if they were just a recent introduction to our consciousness. Of course, these are generic claims, no? And these anecdotes can only suggest a vague time frame for these for the first Chinese-Maranao contact in history. So I went further in my interviews, no, trying to gather stories that my informants heard from their parents or grandparents, no, hoping to identify historical timeline markers. And in my perspectives, and in my interviews, rather, I gathered several reminiscences, no, and um, one informant, for instance, said Malabang is Maranao Iranon territory, no? And there is until now in Malabang. Malabang is actually part of Lanao del Sur that's facing Iliana Bay already, no? The back part of Mindanao, the southern part of Mindanao. And he said, until now there is a Chinese cemetery in Malabang. If you will ask the locals of Malabang how old that cemetery is, they would tell you that it existed even before the coming of the Americans. And then another said, I heard stories that the first Chinese settled not only in Dansalan, which is the old name of Marawi, but also in the town of Masyo, which is the most populous town at the southern shore of Lake Lanao. I also heard stories that they were long present in the town of Ganasi. That's a neighboring town, 31 or 35 kilometers away from Masyo, no? Also at the southern edge, no, of Lake Lanao. And she said, I'm sure if you go to Ganasi to ask people about the Chinese, they would probably have a lot of folk tales about the Chinese to tell. And so, another informant said, based on what I heard from old folks when I was still a child, there were already Chinese in Lanao when Karim ul Makdum arrived in Mindanao. There are several points to emphasize, no, in these above-quoted reminiscences. No. The first claim that the Chinese reached the interior towns like Masyo and Ganasi, as you can see in the map, no, Ganasi and Masyo are towns, no, at the southern edge, no, of Lake Lanao. The first claim that the Chinese reached interior towns like Masyo and Ganasi prior to the coming of the Americans is not unbelievable at all. Why? Because Ganasi is just 31 kilometers away from the coastal settlement of Malabang. Malabang is, there is one oral tradition which says, it was actually in Malabang that Sultan Kudarat first arrived before he settled in Cotabato. So this is an adjacent area to Cotabato. Okay. So sabi niya, Ganasi is just 31 kilometers away, no, from the coastal settlement of Malabang, and the populous town of Masyo is only 37 kilometers away from Ganasi. If the Chinese traders had friends among the coastal Maranaos of Malabang, it was not impossible at all to reach Ganasi from that coastal settlement. And from Ganasi, Masyo is just a few hours walk. Thenceforth, it would not be difficult to reach every town around the lake. No? From Masyo, Marawi is just 35 kilometers, or Dansalan is just 35 kilometers away. No? And so on and so forth. Okay? What is even more significant in the reminiscences is the mention of some historical timeline markers. Take, for instance, Malabang. I think Malabang can be used as a timeline indicator of Chinese presence here in Lanao, because if the assumption is true that the Chinese came only to Lanao after ensuring that they had some sort of protection from the colonizers or from the Spaniards, then Malabang provides us a definite time frame where we are more or less certain of Chinese presence in Lanao. Take note that the Spaniards were able to build a fort in the area in the 17th century. If the construction of this fort was responsible for, attracting the Chinese and other migrants to settle in Malabang, okay, presumably for the protection of the Spaniards could provide, then it may be safe to assume that the Chinese began settling in Malabang around that time when La Sabanilla, the name of the fort, was constructed in 1649. But take note, the Spanish presence in La Sabanilla or in Malabang was short-lived, for in 1662, the Spanish Governor General withdrew all troops in the south in preparation for the impending attack of the Chinese pirate, quote and unquote, Kosinga. Thus, La Sabanilla was abandoned almost immediately after its construction. The fort was only rebuilt and reutilized 200 years later, when the Spanish colonial government attempted to strengthen and consolidate its rule in Mindanao in the later part of the 19th century. So if the Chinese had a cemetery in a place that was not protected for most of its history by the Spaniards, then the Chinese must have been enjoying the protection or friendship of the Moros in that place, the Maranao Moros in particular. Another historical timeline marker that I saw in the reminiscences is the name Macdum. Any student of Mindanao history or Bangsamoro history would know that the appearance of the Macdum is actually a title for somebody who is respected or learned among the Sufi Muslims. As I said, any student of Mindanao history would know that the appearance of the Macdumen, which is plural for Macdum, in the oral traditions and even in the Salsila or the genealogy of the Tausug, Maguindanao, and Maranao royal families would more or less be dated at around 14th century. If our oral informants say that the Maranaos already know the Chinese even prior to the arrival of Macdum, then it is safe to assume that the Chinese-Maranao contact occurred at least 700 years ago. It cannot be later than that as far as Maranao oral history is concerned. And this is not illogical at all. After all, China is nearer to the Philippines compared to the Arabian Peninsula where Islam came. So if the Arabs reached the Philippines in the later centuries, why would it be difficult for us to believe that the Chinese reached Lanao in earlier periods? Well,
Excuse me,
I am
sir.
convinced. Yes,
Sir, one more minute.
it's my. Thank you, thank you.
Okay.
Well, I am convinced that the Maranas had long known the Chinese insofar as their living memory is concerned. I still had to push further my inquiry, and I eventually looked into some aspects of the Maranao culture, and I saw all this. There are practices and part of the material and the non-material culture of the Maranao that shows semblances of Chinese practices, like for example the Naga, which is practically the dragon of the Maranaos. You have so there you can see the Naga design, which is practically Chinese. These are collections of the Aga Khan Museum, as said, more than century old na kabu, which is a wooden jar with Naga design. And then you have the Unta, which is the Maranao version of the dragon or lion dance. You have the Candidiagaw. They also had these professional funeral criers. And then you have the Maranao flags, the Maranao flags. And then you have the Umoy, which I think is, Umoy refers to any ceramic wares from China, which is considered part of the heirloom. But I think even that Umoy is a corrupted term for Amoy, where most of the Chinese in Southeast Asia came from. You have the Kasipa, which is like the Maranao version of the Jiangxi. Then the architecture, this is Alamin, which is a prince's quarter, and then the mosque in Taraka. Was it cultural parallelism or diffusion? I think that what happened to the Maranaos, and the Chinese was that there was cultural diffusion, and more often than not, cultural diffusion, entails contact. Is it direct or indirect? our oral tradition would claim that it was really direct, no? And so if we are to give them a privilege, to give these oral traditions and stories the privilege, it would appear that there was Chinese-Maranao contact, and that contact was a direct one. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Caballero. Now I'd like to welcome Dr. Bernardita Churchill to give her discussion points about the paper.
What do you? Hello?
Hello?
You want me
Yes?
to turn on my video?
Yes, please.
Ah, okay. So I'm all set. I don't know very much about all these little gadgets, so you have to tell me what to do. Point my point.
Yeah, we
Okay.
can see you.
Fantastic lecture, Giovanni. But I have a complaint. You shortchanged me. This is not what you sent for a discussion. But that's all right. I'm going to forgive you because I know you will come to me with more data. So let me respond to the paper that you submitted for me to be a discussant. I do love everything that you said. It was really fantastic. I wish I had all of those data. Okay, let me start with a disclaimer. I am not a historian on Mindanao and Muslim Filipinos. In this case, the Maranaos. I have been to Marawi, and I like the city. I'm not a specialist on the history of the Chinese in the Philippines and Philippine-China relations. I took Chinese history in UP, minored in Chinese history for my MA at Cornell University, and taught the course at De La Salle University. What I am and have been all this time is a student of history, studying the history of my country. But I have had a long love affair with Chinese studies in various circumstances. Dr. Patricio Abinales, the other discussant, is a Mindanaoan and is the best authority on Mindanao history. Teresita is the walking encyclopedia on the history of the Chinese in the Philippines, along with a few other notable academics like Ellen Palanca, Richard Chu, who will be joining us, and those others participating in this conference. The particular significance of this research of Dr. Juvanni Caballero is the presentation of the unique situation of the Maranaos, the last, and I quote him, the last to be conquered by Western colonizers, unquote, and their relations with the Chinese who came to the region. Two previous attempts by the Spaniards in the 17th century and in the last decade of the 19th century had both failed. The Maranaos take pride in that they remained self-governing by, and I quote, the multiple sultanate called the Pangampong Coranao for the entire period of Spanish colonial rule, 1565 to 1898, until the United States acquired the Philippines from Spain and they came under American rule in the first decade of the 20th century. This unusual situation is attributed to the location of the Maranao country, Marawi, in the interior and uplands where the Maranao people have lived and located their power centers. Thus, a conclusion that Lanao was independent in its own right throughout the Spanish period. In such situation of isolation and inaccessibility, is it the case that no direct relations were established between the Maranaos and the Chinese until Maranao country was opened up with American colonization in the 20th century? Using the time frame of, quote, 1898 and earlier, in examining Chinese-Maranao relations, Dr. Caballero presents evidence to belie the impression that the Maranaos, quote, only stayed at the shadows or background of their Maguindanaoan and Tausug neighbors insofar as direct contact with the Chinese was concerned. This was really not the case, as already been shown so adequately in the presentation. The particular significance of this research is presented relative to the unique condition of the Maranao region, being for the last region to be conquered, and now has offered information that such geographic isolation of the Maranao did not result in the absence of relations between the two peoples, as had been heretofore assumed. One concrete evidence, is provided by the recent archaeological findings in Nunungan, an interior municipality in Lanao del Norte, which had yielded some Chinese porcelainware dating to the late Sung and Ming dynasties, 11th, 12th to the 15th and 16th century. It is proposed that these tentative findings would probably revise earlier assumptions on Chinese contacts with the Maranao, which had been presented to have been indirectly through Sulu or Maguindanao. Philippine-China relations date back to the Sung dynasty, 10th century, maybe even earlier. Chinese historians I met in Guangzhou said it is probably as early as the Sui dynasty. Needless to say, aside from archaeological evidences, documentary materials in archives and museums would be invaluable in validating the findings that have or would come from this research. Oral history was the major research tool used in this project. And to capture other dimensions of Maranao history, most especially Maranao encounters and interactions with the Chinese. It should be noted that oral history should be validated with available manuscript document resources as they are accessed. It has been generally advanced that documentary historical sources prior to 1898 refer mainly to the Spanish colonial records, which contain data on Spanish colonial rule of the peoples they had colonized, but not much of the colonized people. Consequently, they presumably should not be used for historical research as much as possible. Perhaps we can use a historiographic strategy advised by William Henry Scott, which you already mentioned, looking through the cracks in the parchment curtain to signify the official documents of the Spanish colonial regime, which prevent the modern Filipino from forming a clear picture of his ancestors' conditions. Dr. Caballero notes that indeed there is an absence of studies on Chinese-Maranao encounters, and I put encounters in quotations. I find the use of the word encounter between these two peoples, too aggressive, and would prefer one more peaceful term to describe the contact or relations between them. Payag ka ba? The noticeable scarcity, if not absence, of the Maranao in the early records of many Western travelers, observers, and chronicles and colonizers may be due to the fact that the Maranaos are, and I quote, racially and culturally indistinguishable from the other Moros at first glance. Besides, the Maranao region is too remote to access because of their upcountry agricultural orientation, as noted by James Warren. There is no question of the crucial role of the Chinese in facilitating economic exchange between the Spanish-controlled communities and the surrounding Moro communities. The Chinese have, and I quote, immemorially traded with these islands, referring to the Philippine Islands. Documents, and I quote again, also reported some forms of interaction and trade going on between the Spanish colony of Iligan and the Maranaos of the Lake region through the facilitation of the Chinese, unquote. This study basically presents the history of relations between Maranao and Chinese prior to 1898, characterized by, quote, peaceful economic and cultural exchanges, unquote, thus filling up a huge historiographic gap. Written records that sila, Maranao genealogy, are not available to outsiders and so were not used in the research. Am I right? Oral history was provided by an impressive list of personalities. Maranao scholars and historians from MSU Marawi, educators, cultural advocates and workers, descendants of the Chinese residents of Marawi, old-time residents of Marawi and neighboring municipalities. Their oral recollections were valuable information, albeit not supported by documents. It should be noted that oral history should be corroborated where and when possible, of which Dr. Caballero seems fully aware. I would like to take note to tell you that the historical data papers are available in the National Library. I don't know how much is there as far as Lanao or Marawi, but there are some tidbits of information that might be useful for your purposes. No, let me note here, attention should be given to these family records. I'm talking about the written records. So they are not damaged by hostilities or environmental climate disasters. I became aware of such destruction or damage during the last military operations in Marawi, when I was later requested to review for funding by the Prince Claus Foundation in the Netherlands, a project proposal by the Grupo Kalinangan to digitize and restore some of those damaged documents. Are you familiar with this, Giovanni? Okay. I approved and endorsed the project, and I understand the project has been published. I still have to get a copy. I also remember that valuable materials and artifacts were lost in the fire in Dansalan several years ago, or was that also at the museum? As rightly noted by Dr. Caballero, and I quote, the ubiquitous character of the Chinese and the known character of the Maranaos to travel and trade, as well as the strong traces of Chinese influences on and or cultural influences on and or cultural similarities with the Maranas were actually the beginnings of his researchers hypothesis that it must have been impossible for the two peoples not to have met in the relatively small and contiguous space of Southeast Asia at some point in the you noted long lost history. It's not lost and it is long. Okay. Noted in the paper are two components of the research: archival research from UP Los Baños and Xavier University, and archaeological research from the Archaeological Studies Program of UP Diliman. May I also suggest the Archaeological Division of the National Museum of the Philippines? Dr. Luis Bologna will be very happy to see you. I will tell her you're coming, which has a very extensive collection of Chinese porcelain pottery and other artifacts from China and Southeast Asia with prehistoric relations with areas in Mindanao. I might also want, if you haven't been to the National Museum lately, there is a permanent exhibit there in the Lumad Gallery of old photographs which come from my collection. The oral history provided in this paper was quite impressive, intensive, and authoritative, providing insights into Lanao's pre-colonial times. Fieldwork done in Iligan, Marawi, Lanao del Norte, and Lanao del Sur consistently affirm, and I quote, the hypothesis that the Chinese had reached the Maranao areas not only in the settlements along the coast, like Iligan and Malabang, but even interior Maranao communities, including Dansalan, old name of Marawi, and Nunungan. The Maranao term for Chinese is Lalang. The Maranao term for jar and other ceramics is Omoy, as you have mentioned, where many Hokkien-speaking Chinese immigrants to the Philippines and Southeast Asia came from. These are important historical details. I must say that I learned a lot of history in the paper, and I look forward to more of your research, including the one that you presented today, Giovanni. Thank you and good evening from Washington, D.C.
Thank you very much.
For the very kind words, Dr. Mamnita.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Churchill. All right. Next, let's call Dr. Abinales to give his discussion points.
Maayong buntag sa inyong tanan, maayong hapon. Wassalamualaikum, Giovanni. And I would take a bow to my Professor Churchill. And it's very scary to follow her because...
Hindi na baling baw, wala nang baw.
Nakakatakot kayo, ma'am. Okay, thank you very much at the Confucius Institute for inviting me to share with some of my thoughts on this really fantastic paper, in the sense that, you know, it's a preliminary, no way? Giovanni? Yes, okay. I sometimes will probably slip into Visayan because I'm talking to a fellow Mindanaoan. So, okay. So I just would like to ask, there are a couple of things that I just want Giovanni to consider. in terms of how he can move forward with the research. Okay. So the first thing he mentioned is that I can share now. I can share my screen. There you go. Okay. Okay. I made a slideshow for Judah's presentation. Okay. So I was when I was reading his paper, I was about to start reviewing a book by Heather Sutherland. This came out this year. It's late last year. It's called Safeway and Gatekeepers. It's an interesting take because it looks at the smaller port cities, port towns, seaports that have been trading with China since 12th, 13th century. So it's not Singapore. It's not the Srivijayan Empire. It's just small places: Borneo, Ternate, Tidor. And the interesting thing about the book is there's no mention of Lanao. And the question then is why? And Juvanni actually has a point here. It's like, what's peculiar about Lanao is that it's non-accessible. He even uses the word terra incognita. And the only time we heard of Lanao as people in the post-war, post-colonial period is when the Spaniards came in and the Maranaos resisted them. It is also an interesting city because once the American came in, it was actually the headquarters of the American army outside of Zamboanga. And nobody's written about that. The second point that Giovanni's paper sort of got me interested is the dilemma of all pre-colonial societies. There is no data, there is no paper written. Archaeology is a hit and miss affair. And the only source we actually have, not only in the past, but also in the present, are the memories of people. That was the problem I encountered when I was doing my research on colonial Mindanao, or even post-war Mindanao. The reaction of people, of local newspapers was to all say, ay, wala na kaming document, iho, pinakilo na namin. So this is the oddity then of Maranao resistance. There is no paper. And so you play with, you have memories, but the interesting thing about memories is that that is the only card you're dealt with. You have no option, right? And so there's two purposes here. It's to collect those memories and preserve them, not as the definitive description of what Maranao society is, but as a foundation for future research. Right? Now, the one thing that's really odd about this paper is Juvanni says, yeah, there's actually something written there, and it's the Tarsila, but you can touch that because it's very scary, you know. So it's a weird document because it's an old document with contemporary implications. Because I suspect the Tarsila, a lot of the Tarsilas are genuine, but also a lot of them are invented, no? And if you follow the Tarsila, there's probably like very much like Catholic, you know, birth certificates, yung sinong kabit ni di ba? O yung anak na pala sa gawas labas ni ito, di ba? So I suspect, I'm not sure about Tarsila.
Pati mga aswang, sino yung mga ng aswang, Sergio, no?
The aswang. Okay, so aswang means,
aswang.
Yeah, so therefore it's something that's really interesting because it's an old document that we cannot access. But maybe there's a way out of it, and it comes from science. And I'm not being facetious about it, but studies on DNA research, ancestry.com actually can be a good way of compensating for the inaccessibility of Tarsila, figuring out where you came from through your DNA. So that's available now. That's the first thing I want to raise. The second thing, I think the difficulty of writing about, and this is from Heather Sutherland's piece, about the Maranao's place in pre-colonial history is the fact that, if you look at, this is what Sutherland tracked in her book. And if you look at where Maranao's place, wala talaga, no? In this trade with China. So in the trade with China, Sutherland mentions that from Southeast Asia, the Chinese need sandalwood, sapan wood for dyes, tortoise shells, sea cucumbers, a bird's nest. Okay. The question then is, why was Giovanni's arguing that the Maranao is actually part of this trade with China because the Chinese were there. So the question to ask them is, what was being traded by the Maranaos? Okay. Because I don't think Dato Faisal is right. The Chinese who were in Southeast Asia before the Spaniards came were not pirates, they were traders. Okay. The only time that the Chinese Empire projected its power was the fleet, the Qing Dynasty fleet, right? So the question is, how do we solve this? And here again, science comes in, because there is now a growing tradition study of environmental history, which is one way of examining this is to figure out what kinds of products did the forests surrounding the lake, what kinds of products were they producing, and whether they were profitable, or whether they were traded as part of the larger Maguindanao Sultanate trade in that area, given Malabang. No? The other thing is Juvanni mentions the presence of jars. Now, what are the patrimony of jars? We can find it in Lanao, we can find it in Manila, but we can find it in Hokkien China, in southern China. And here is probably one of the things that the Confucius Institute and universities back home would be interested in, which is not only require our students to study English, but also Chinese, Maranao, Maguindanao, Tausug, Bisaya. Because my friends in the southern Philippines, my favorite smugglers speak 8 languages. Okay. The frontier, the backward frontier, is more cosmopolitan and more polyglot than us. And if we need to move forward our research on Lanao's place in this extensive South Asia trade that is determined by China, we need to study Chinese. Okay. Now, the other thing that's really interesting, after Professor Churchill mentioned, is this. Again, this is from Sutherland's piece. If you again look at the directions of the trade, it is going to China, but you have this. Oh, sorry. I am very bad at this. My daughter is not here. So. Okay, one second. This, the puzzle of this. What exactly was going here? We can understand the Chinese jars coming here, but this one seems to be very interesting. And what makes it doubly interesting is everybody assumes that everything goes to China. Yes, but the centerpiece of this trade is this place called Sulawesi. And it's a very fascinating place. When I was in 2008, I was going with my Japanese colleagues in this area. In this place called Paulo, this small village, small town, very boring place. You know, you hit by a tsunami a few years ago. We were sleeping, we stayed overnight in Paulo in this really rinky-dink hotel. And in the second floor, I went up and there were all these beautiful Indonesian prostitutes. Okay. And they looked at my Japanese colleagues and said, Japanese. And then they saw me and said, you're not Japanese. I said, yeah, I'm Filipino. And they started talking Filipino to me. In this place like Paulo, in places like Lanao, you have these people who have been communicating with each other. And I thought, so why are you speaking Filipino again? I said, well, Filipinos, there were illegal Filipino fishermen in this area. And when the Indonesian Navy pursued them, they would hide in Paulo for 3-4 months. And like any seafarer, Filipino seafarer, how do you spend your time? You eat, you drink, and you sing to the ladies. So these Japanese, Indonesian prostitutes, Muslims, mind you, had a good time with Filipinos. So again, the point is, it's not only China, but this place called Sulawesi may help us explain this direction of the trade in coastal area in between China and the Lanao and the rest of Southeast Asia. The third thing I want to present is that Giovanni mentioned Malabang. Okay, and the interesting thing about Malabang is that we actually don't know what's being traded there. No, we know that timber was traded here, but this is 1900s already, and the Chinese were connecting to Cebu, courtesy of the coming of the steamship. Okay, courtesy of the building of forts here and here. But we don't know what's here. And my suspicion is what is ever traded here was part of what the Maguindanao Sultanate was trading in Singapore, in the rest of Southeast Asia. The question then is there a source in which we can look at a Maguindanao Sultanate's boat and see how things are divided? And my suggestion probably is something to do with us studying two other languages, Malay and Arabic. Because remember, the Arabs were not just in the Southeast Asia region to preach and convert. They were primarily traders. So if there are traders, then there are documents. because simple cost and profit and loss, etc. So this is probably another area that the Confucius Institute may expand, may promote, which is studying Malay and Arabic, apart from Chinese. So, but the other interesting thing to study really is the archaeology of the environment. I'll be matatapos na ako. The archaeology of the environment in this area. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Oops. Yes, the archaeology of the environment in this area. Yeah. Sorry, ma'am. Okay. What is the archaeology of the? What is here? What is being produced here? The only thing I know that currently it's where shabu is being produced, no? Methamphetamines and a lot of illegal logging here going through Cagayan de Oro. But it's an old rainforest, okay? And therefore, if you go study the history of rainforest, it will reveal as much as what things the Maranao is trading. And finally, the one thing, so this is 1600s, no? The Mindanao connections. So instead of us looking towards there, we should probably look towards here. And my suspicion is there was no problem between Magindanaos and Maranaos. And remember, trade was enhanced by intermarriages, diba? And one of the things that stabilized the Chinese presence in Southeast Asia is that they marry into the local family because the Chinese guy is the collateral, so that his partners will come back and pay for what was being exported by the sultanates to China. So, and the last point I want to consider is this, okay? In the Spanish period and in the early American period, the problem of why Lanao is not part of it is because, as Warren pointed out, this is where the slave trade was going. The British were here, Portuguese were here, and the Dutch. So yung pull factors were here. And therefore, Lanao, in a certain way, ironically, was saved from this until, okay, the Maranaos got involved and joined in the raiding because, and this is something that we really don't know, of the discovery that having slaves is a very profitable business. So the question to ask then is, at what point did the Maranaos join what Warren talked about and why? Okay. A final point, which is the American period. Okay, I think Juvanni mentioned that the Americans, can be a source of data. Probably one of the interesting things that the Americans did was not to just destroy the Muslims and educate them, but to send missionaries. And one of the sources that have not been studied is the compilation of the Summer Institute of Linguistics, which is a missionary mission that the Americans had. And if you look at them, it's extremely boring words, but it gives you a history of words came from. Okay, so like inchik, really, and the Americans were really, the missionaries were really prodigious about this because they want to convert people, no? And so I think Professor Churchill can help us with this, but those data that the SIL compilation, I think are still at UP or the National Library or even at Ateneo. So yun lang po. Maraming salamat. Daghang kayong salamat, bye. Very, very fun piece to read. Thank you.
Okay, thank you,
so
Dr.
much.
Abinales. Maybe we'll give siguro 1 minute na lang. I'm sorry because we ate a lot of time to
Okay,
consider the other speakers. Let's just give 1 minute for Dr. Juvanni to reply.
It will not even take 1 minute. No, my heart is filled with gratitude, no, beyond words. Thank you, Ma'am Nita, and thank you, Sir Jojo, no, for the kind words and for the suggestions para sa mga next steps, no, to enhance the research. Thank you so much.
You have to study Chinese.
Thank you very much, our speaker and our discussants. What a fascinating opening to our conference. Now let's move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Jely Galang. Dr. Galang is an assistant professor of history at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. His research interests include the 19th century Philippines, Chinese in Southeast Asia, and history of crime and punishment. He is currently working on a paper about the Chinos Macanistas, or Cantonese Chinese, in the 19th century Philippines. And the discussants for this paper are first Dr. Richard Chu. He is a five-college professor of history at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He is the author of several books and articles on the Chinese diaspora in the Philippines, including Chinese and Chinese of Manila, Family, Identity, and Culture, 1860s to 1930s, and the editor of More Chinoy Than We Admit, Chinese-Filipino Interactions Over the Centuries. Our second discussant will be Dr. Filomeno Aguilar, Jr. Dr. June Aguilar is Professor of History at the Department of History at the Ateneo de Manila University. He completed his PhD at Cornell University in 1992, where he received the Lauriston Sharp Prize for Outstanding Contribution to Southeast Asian Studies. From 2003 to 2021, he was Chief Editor of Philippine Studies, Historical and Ethnographic Viewpoints. And with that, let's welcome our second speaker, Dr. Jely Galang.
Good morning, everyone. Okay, the title of my paper is the 1864 Sino-Spanish Treaty and the Chinese in the Philippines, 1871 to 1896. But before I begin my presentation, I would just like to express my utmost gratitude to the Confucius Institute at Ateneo de Manila University for providing funds necessary for the conduct of this research, to the conduct and writing of this paper. I also thank the directors of the institute, Dr. Ellen Palanca and Dr. Cynthia Liang, as well as the CI staff, Steph and Chris, for providing help. From the time that we had the seminar workshop in November 2019, before the pandemic, until now that we're presenting on our final output in this research. Maraming salamat po. Thank you so much. Bigla akong kinabahan, no? Because of the distinguished scholars that we have with us today. I would like to say good morning to everyone, like Dr. Churchill, Dr. Abinales, Dr. Chu, Dr. Aguilar, Ma'am Tess Yangsi is also here. Thank you. I know I will learn a lot from our discussion this morning. So the goal of my paper is to explain how the 1864 Sino-Spanish Treaty affected the Chinese in the Philippines, particularly during the latter part of the 19th century. So it's rather straightforward. The 1864 Sino-Spanish Treaty is commonly discussed in international relations and Philippine colonial history. In international relations, the 1864 treaty is commonly discussed within the context of how China and Spain, as sovereign states, utilized the treaty to their advantage, and how China used it to negotiate with Spain regarding the Chinese coolies in Cuba, which during the second half of the 19th century was still part of the Spanish Empire, of course, including the Philippines and Puerto Rico. Within Philippine colonial history, it's actually Wickberg, Edgar Wickberg, who used this 1864 treaty in his book, The Chinese in Philippine Life, to discuss how the Philippine Chinese used the treaty, especially in the 1880s, to argue for the establishment of a Chinese consulate in the colony. So in this presentation, I'll be focusing on how the treaty was used by different actors and groups and institutions to further advance, protect, and maintain their interests in the Philippines. So I'll be using three case studies to highlight this aspect of the treaty. The first one, I'll be focusing on the new immigration and residence policies imposed upon the transient Chinese in 1871. The second case study is about the importation of Chinese laborers from Singapore to a tobacco plantation in Holosulu in 1889. And the last one is the increase in the amount of disembarkation fee to be imposed upon new Chinese immigrants in 1894. The main sources of information I used for this paper are materials from the Archivo Histórico Nacional in Madrid, Spain. Fortunately, before we had the seminar workshop in November, I was in Spain in July and August, and I was able to gather materials about this particular topic. So I used them to reconstruct the effects of the treaty on the Chinese in the Philippines during the latter part of the 19th century. The second important source of materials is the National Archives of the Philippines in Manila, particularly the 148 bundles, the Chinos bundles at the NAP. Okay, so the Sino-Spanish Treaty of 1864, in English, it's the treaty, the full title of the treaty is Treaty of Friendship, Commerce, and Navigation. So the photo on your right is the first page of the treaty. This is in Spanish. Now, I got a copy of this from the National Library of Spain. Now, it was signed in 1864 by the representatives of the Spanish legation in China and the representatives of the Qing government. It was signed in Tianjin and it was ratified 3 years later. The treaty was signed during the era of unequal treaties. Unequal treaties because these agreements were signed from a position of power disparity between China and Western countries, wherein the latter, the Western countries, benefited the most. The goal of the treaty, the Sino-Spanish Treaty of 1864, was to establish closer diplomatic and political ties and better economic relations between Spain and China. It has 52 articles, which were most of these articles were taken directly from earlier treaties signed between China and other Western powers. So just to give you a broader view of the 1864 treaty, so China began signing treaties with other Western countries after her defeat, China's defeat in the First Opium War in 1842. So 1842, Great Britain had a treaty with China, the Treaty of Nanjing, and then the United States, and so on and so forth. So it was on October 10, 1864, that Spain was able to secure a treaty with China. So like I mentioned, the official English title of the treaty is the Sino-Spanish Treaty of Friendship, Commerce, and Navigation. The Sino-Spanish Treaty only had one article that specifically deals with the Philippines. In Article 47, it states that Chinese merchant vessels, without limitation of number, shall be at liberty to trade with the Philippines and shall be treated as those most favored nation. Should Spain hereafter concede any fresh advantages to the merchants of another nation, Chinese merchants shall enjoy them like the merchants of the most favored nation. So in essence, the treaty covered Spain, not only Spain, but also Spain's overseas colonies like the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. Although, as I mentioned, there's only one article in the treaty that deals specifically on the Philippines. In essence, the treaty had to be applied also to Spain's overseas colonies, including, of course, the Philippines. So let's move on to the case studies. So that's the first part is about the treaty. Let's move on to the case studies. So the first one is the Spanish colonial state and the transient Chinese, in 1870s, early part of 1870s. So when Governor General Rafael Izquierdo came to the Philippines in 1871, he proposed that an extensive investigation had to be conducted to know the conditions of the Chinese in the Philippines, because he believed that the Chinese were very crucial in the economic life of the colony. One of the findings of the investigation was that there were numerous undocumented Chinese in the Philippines during that time, 1870s, or even before that. And these undocumented Chinese were not paying their taxes to the government. To understand the issue of undocumented Chinese during this period, we need to go back in history and discuss the types, quote unquote, of Chinese, based on the taxation system in 1839 and 1852. Based on the tax systems, there were three types of Chinese in the Philippines. The resident Chinese, or the radicados, the transient Chinese, or the transientes, and the wintering, or the invernados. So the radicados were permanent residents. They were registered, they were paying their taxes. Of course, some of them were not paying their taxes, but on official records, they were permanent. And then we have the transient Chinese. They were temporarily living in the Philippines. They were allowed to stay here for 3 months. And they could extend, actually. But after another 3 months, they had to apply whether they have to apply to become resident of the colony or they need to go back to China. Okay? The third one is the invernados. They were also temporary residents in the Philippines, and they were allowed to stay for 6 months. And after that, they had to go back to China. Okay? As mentioned, so those were the types of the Chinese in the Philippines during the early part of the 19th century. So with regard to the transient Chinese, they were overstaying. They were here beyond the allowed 6-month period, and they were not paying their taxes, which, based on the investigation conducted during Izquierdo's time, they were not paying their taxes, which could reach up to 5,000 pesos annually. So it was a very big concern for the colonial government. So they had to find a way to make these transients register and pay their taxes. In 1871, there were according to the investigation conducted, there were 18,000 transient Chinese, and only 12,000 had proper documents. So around 6,000 were undocumented, but they were still staying in the Philippines and engaging in different commercial activities. So Izquierdo, Governor General Izquierdo, proposed that the government had to impose a stricter immigration and registration policy. But this policy had to be approved by the Madrid government. So that's the first case. The second case is the German Borneo Company in Sulu and the Chinese coolies from Singapore. This was in 1889. So in September of 1888, the Spanish colonial government in Manila issued a decree related to Chinese immigration. Now, based on the September 1888 decree, all Chinese coming to the Philippines had to disembark only at the port of Manila. So the Chinese were not allowed to come to the Philippines via other parts of other ports, for instance, but they were only allowed to disembark at the port of Manila in Luzon. The rationale behind this was that to prevent undocumented Chinese to come to the Philippines through the backdoor route in Sulu, because there were numerous Chinese who were coming to the Philippines through the south, not from the north, not from Luzon to Manila. So that was the 1888 decree. A year before the decree was issued, the German Borneo Company established a tobacco plantation in Holo, Sulu. And the process was the company was employing Chinese laborers from Singapore instead of Manila or from Fujian, for instance. The 1888 immigration decree, according to the German ambassador to Spain during this time, the decree disrupted the importation of coolies from Singapore. It would be financially disastrous for the company because the company had to relocate the coolies from Singapore to Manila, and then from Manila to Jolo. So it was not feasible. It was possible, but it would cost them a lot of money. So the German ambassador to Spain filed a complaint, that this particular decree was discriminatory, and this ran against the 1864 Sino-Spanish Treaty, stating that Chinese laborers in Spanish colonies had to be treated well, similar to how Spain treat other foreign laborers in her colonies. So the third case study is about the Chinese government and Chinese disembarkation fee between 1839 and 1896. In December 1894, the Chinese ambassador to Spain, in behalf of the Philippine Chinese, filed a complaint against this particular policy. In the earlier part of 1894, Governor General Blanco wanted to increase the disembarkation fee of the Chinese immigrants coming to the Philippines from 10 pesos to 20 pesos per person. Why? Because the government wanted to generate more funds from the Chinese. Since madaming pumupunta na mga Chinese, why not impose a higher fee, transportation fee from these people? The decree was issued on July 14, 1894. So if we read the complaint of the Chinese ambassador to Spain, he was against it. The Philippine Chinese were against it. Philippine Chinese in Manila were against it because basically it was burdensome for the laboring class Chinese who were coming to the Philippines. And number two, it would be burdensome for the coolie brokers and cabecillas. These are the employers who provide funds for the coming of the Chinese coolies from southern China to Manila. So those are the three case studies that I focused on. So to analyze these cases, I'll just focus on third and fourth rows. So the result in case one about the transient Chinese, the policy of implementing stricter immigration and residence policies was approved. Why? Because for Madrid, it was the 1864 treaty allows this kind of policies. It was approved but had to impose also upon other foreigners in the Philippines. So based on the Ley de Extranjería of 1870, so the other foreigners coming to the Philippines and living in the Philippines also had to follow stricter immigration and residence policies. So what were the impacts of the approval of this particular policy on the Chinese in the Philippines? One, the Chinese had to follow stricter immigration, taxation, and registration policies. Number two, discrimination. They experienced discrimination during house and building inspections by the Spanish colonial authorities because from the point of view of the Spaniards, there were still many undocumented Chinese and they were hiding. So the colonial government had to conduct surprise visits, surprise inspections. No? And they were, most of the time, there were a lot of issues concerning this house and building inspection. And then number 3 would be the emergence, quote unquote, or the continued presence of undocumented Chinese and the connivance with Chinese and Chinese mestizo kabisillas. Kasi itatago ng mga kabisillas o mga employers yung mga undocumented Chinese in order for them not to pay the taxes for their laborers and workers. The second case, Chinese immigration to Sulu, the result was Spain did not approve the complaint it's because of the different readings of the treaty, specifically on the Chinese subject contracted by Spanish subjects. So based on the 1864 treaty, specific articles in that treaty only mentions Chinese subjects contracted by Spanish subjects in Spain and in her overseas colonies. So in the case of the Chinese immigration via Sulu, the Chinese coolies from Singapore were not contracted or hired by Spanish subjects, but by foreign company, which was the German Bernardita company. So what was the impact of, or what were the impacts of this disapproval? The Chinese had to disembark only at the port of Manila. Second, the concentration of Chinese in Manila, and Manila continued to become the training ground for new immigrants. And of course, the unlawful entries of Chinese immigrants via Sulu continued. And number 3, the case study 3, the disembarkation fee. The result was Spain did not approve Blanco's proposal. The Madrid government categorically stated that this policy ran contrary with the most favored nation clause in the 1864 treaty. So the impact of this disapproval on the Chinese in the Philippines, less financial obligations of the Philippine Chinese to the government. Hindi sila magbabayad ng additional fees. So in conclusion, the 1864 Spanish Treaty was utilized and invoked not only by Spain and China, but also by other groups and actors to protect and maintain their interests in the Philippines. Spanish colonial government, German ambassador, German Bernardita Company, Chinese ambassador, and the Philippine Chinese were some of the groups and actors that used and invoked the treaty to their advantage. The results of the negotiations that occurred among these role players had direct and indirect impacts on the lives of the Chinese in the late 19th century Philippines. Yun lamang po. Maraming salamat.
Thank you very much, Dr. Galang. Right now, let's call on Dr. Richard Chu to discuss the paper.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Galang, for that very informative and interesting presentation. Thank you to the Confucius Institute for inviting me to participate in this conference. Thank you to Dr. Ellen Palanca and Director Liang Wang Han, and to the staff of the Confucius Institute. Good morning to everyone, including to the other discussants and what I appreciate about Dr. Jely Galang's work is how it not only expands and deepens our knowledge about the history of the Chinese diaspora in the Philippines, but also contributes to certain historiographical themes in the field, namely the Chinese under Spanish colonialism in the 19th century, and the theme of transnationalism/regionalism. In regards to the history of the Chinese diaspora in the Philippines, Dr. Galang builds on the work of previous scholars such as Edgar Wickberg to focus on certain areas of history that have been neglected or ignored. And this is the Sino-Spanish Treaty of 1864 and how it impacted the Chinese in the Philippines. Even if there was only one clause in the treaty pertaining to the Chinese in the Philippines, we can see from Dr. Galang's work how, through the three examples or cases he described, how the Chinese were affected by the treaty, or how they themselves used the treaty to protect themselves from restrictive and abusive colonial measures. Dr. Galang's dissertation and various published works have demonstrated to us the inner workings of the Spanish colonial empire. In mining previously unused or underutilized sources, he has given us detailed studies of how the Spanish penal, immigration, or labor systems, and in this paper, Spain's foreign relations operated. One thing that caught my attention in Dr. Galang's work is when he mentioned how the Chinese representatives in Spain wanted the Chinese in the Philippines to be regarded as quote-unquote foreigners, so that they were not treated differently and discriminatorily by the Spanish colonial government in charging extra fees for the importation of coolie labor. Wickberg mentioned in his work how, at the latter part of the 19th century, the Spaniards were beginning to treat the Chinese more as a national instead of a cultural minority, and that the Chinese community itself was beginning to see itself as such. Dr. Galang's work supports Wickberg's point by providing some of the historical evidence of this transition of the Chinese's position within Spanish colonial society. Another area that I appreciate about Dr. Galang's paper is how his study relates to other works using a transnational or regional framework when examining the Chinese diaspora in the Philippines. And if I may say so, the other papers also that are going to be presented, including the one by Dr. Caballero, also utilizes kind of a regional transnational framework. As co-editors of a special forum on the Chinese diaspora in the Philippines for the online journal Critica Cultura, Caroline Howe and I write, and I quote, "Studying ethnic Chinese histories necessitates the extension of the geographic boundaries of what constitutes Philippine history, because these migrants were not bachelors who did not maintain familial ties with people in East or Southeast Asia," end of quote. In the same way, Galang's case studies, which demonstrates Spanish colonial administrators reaching out to Madrid, a German company wanting to import Chinese from Singapore, and a Chinese legation in Madrid speaking on behalf of the Chinese in the Philippines, invites us to veer away from focusing too much on the histories of the Chinese in the Philippines, in and around Manila, or just within the Philippines. The case studies point to the multiple players as well to the multiple sites that make up the history of the Chinese diaspora in the Philippines. Dr. Galang's case involving a German company seeking indemnity from Spain for requiring the workers it sought to pass through Manila resonates with some of the things that I have discovered in my own current research on the Chinese in the Philippines during the early American colonial period. While conducting research on the Chinese exclusion laws in the Philippines, I found one document at the National Archives and Records Management in College Park, Maryland, that shows how some Chinese were trying to enter the Philippines through Sandakan, Borneo, and that the American consul, Lester Maynard, at Sandakan, was suggesting that the Chinese detective from the Holo Custom Bureau should be placed under investigation because this detective, identified as Eng Sien to the Hokkiens, and I quote, and Wong Sio to the Macau, has been working in connection with Hopchuan, Kinsewet, and Hokkien, traders of Sandakan, and has received 40 Borneo currency for each Chinaman landed in the Philippine Islands. So you can see here the different players involved in the history of the Chinese in the Philippines. What these cases clearly show is that the quote-unquote Chinese in the Philippines under Spanish and American colonial periods were entering not only through Manila, but also through other ports in the Philippines, as well as other states in Southeast Asia. Moreover, these Chinese were not necessarily from Fujian or even Guangdong. For instance, in 1902, a foreign company based in Manila petitioned the Bureau of Customs in the Philippines to allow it to bring in Straits-born and Baba Chinese, from the Straits settlement, to be employed as cashiers. The company argued that the Chinese exclusion laws did not apply to their employees since they belong to a, quote, different race and are so considered by the government of the Straits settlements, which are their home, that they are British subjects and descendants of British subjects, end of quote. The company further argued that, quote, their forefathers, that is these Chinese that they wanted to bring in from the Straits, emigrated from China and settled in the Straits, intermarrying with Malay women for some generations, with the result that a distinct race has been formed who are different from both the Chinese and the Malays. That of late years, many of them have discarded the Q, and that few of them talk Chinese, their own language being Malay. That they are the cashiers and godown keepers of the Straits settlements and do the greater part of the clerical work there. And furthermore, that the company has found it impossible to obtain suitable men in the Philippines to work in its cash departments, end of quote. In giving his decision in regard to this case, W. Morgan Schuster, the Collector of Customs for the Philippines, pointed out that the Chinese Exclusion Act, as applied in the Philippines, prohibited Chinese and persons of Chinese descent unless they belong to the exempt class or if they were merchants, for example. Hence, these Straits-born and Baba Chinese were denied entry into the Philippines. In conclusion, Dr. Jely Galang's paper has enriched our knowledge about the history of the Chinese in the Philippines during the last few decades of the Spanish colonial period. His body of works, which I have the pleasure of being familiar with, has given us at least two things to think about. First is whether the Spanish colonial government was as ineffective, inefficient, or in a desultory state as past scholarship has described it to be during its last decades or years of rule in the Philippines. When one digs into the Spanish archives and write about the inner workings of the Spanish colonial state, as Dr. Galang has done, one begins to see the intricacy and complexity of its institutions in carrying out or implementing government policies, including those that pertain to the Chinese in the Philippines. Second, Dr. Galang has ably used these same sources to focus on the lesser-known Chinese diasporic subjects, such as vagabonds, prisoners, and laborers. This leads us to constantly remind ourselves of the heterogeneity of the Chinese or so-called Chinese diasporic community in the Philippines, and that in our research, we be as inclusive as possible in whom we consider as making up this community. So I just have a couple of questions to end this for Dr. Galang to think about. One is the question of the Chinese in Spain. So you mentioned that the treaty has mentioned about allowing Chinese subjects to come in if they're working for Spanish subjects, but that also applied to the Chinese coming to Spain. So I don't know if you have found any also in your research of Chinese migrating to Spain during that time, either through Manila or directly from China. And the other thing that I would like you to consider is also the role of the British Empire at the time, especially in Spanish colonial Philippines. How would you fit in the British Empire and its British subjects, like those who were in Singapore or coming from the Straits settlements, how they participated or figure in this period of history that you are investigating. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chu. Next, please, let's request Dr. June Aguilar to come forward and please discuss the paper.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, and congratulations to the Confucius Institute for organizing this interesting conference, and congratulations to Dr. Galang for a very well-written paper. This paper points out that Article 47 of the 1864 Sino-Spanish Treaty was unusual. Unlike the unequal treaties of this period, in the 1864 treaty with Spain, China was able to assert its interests, specifically in relation to Chinese merchants and vessels in the Philippines. Granting China the status of the most favored nation represented an acknowledgement and recognition of her sovereignty and international standing. This sole reference to the Philippines thus had great significance for parity and reciprocity in Sino-Spanish relations. And it is good that Dr. Galang focuses his paper on this treaty. As Dr. Galang states, while the treaty allowed an unlimited number of Chinese trading ships to enter and trade in the Philippines, this actually did not happen. In fact, the number of Chinese vessels arriving in Manila in the years after the treaty dwindled. Dr. Galang cites Edgar Wickberg's supposition, quote, "It is possible, according to Wickberg, that the expression Chinese merchant vessel was intended to encourage either a revival of the junk trade or a development of trade in Chinese-owned Western-style vessels," unquote. As a reader, I would have appreciated if Dr. Galang had examined if in fact Dr. Wickberg's conjecture had any basis, because by this time, several years have passed and maybe we can look at Wickberg's conjecture at this point. Dr. Galang emphasizes also that, quote, "three key players, China, Spain, and the Philippine Chinese, contributed to the drafting, negotiation, and signing of the treaty," unquote. Clearly, Spanish and Chinese officials were key players in treaty negotiation, but I find it difficult to find direct evidence on the inclusion of the Philippine Chinese in the treaty negotiation. I believe it is an inference that goes against what David Martinez Robles states about this treaty when he said that, when Martinez says that the Chinese negotiators, quote, "knew that there was a significant number of Chinese living in the Philippines, but did not know the real conditions in which most of them were living and working." Martinez goes on to say, tellingly, while the Spanish treaty mentions the Chinese merchants, it makes no mention of the coolies, unquote. The 1864 treaty affected the Philippine Chinese, but we need direct evidence that the Philippine Chinese were actually key players in treaty negotiation as claimed in this paper. Now, the crux of the paper looks into, as we have heard, 3 case studies in which the 1864 treaty was invoked by different groups to protect and promote their economic interests. And we have to congratulate Dr. Galang for being able to discover these cases in the different archives. Now, my comments are really more on how to perhaps gain a different or a better appreciation of these case studies. Now, on the first case on the transient Chinese, according to Dr. Galang, quote, it was estimated that there were around 18,000 transient Chinese in the Philippines who were registered but were not paying their rightful contributions to the Philippines, and only about 12,000 possessed proper documents. These overstaying and undocumented transient Chinese were causing the colonial treasury some 50,000 pesos annually. As such, they pose a serious threat to the colony's financial stability, unquote. The concern for these unpaid fees, I think, can be better appreciated if it is put in the context of the dire fiscal situation of the Philippines in the 1860s and 1870s, especially given the huge debts that the colonial government owed to tobacco growers who were not being paid for their crops as intended by the tobacco monopoly. And as we know, by the 1870s, they were already planning to end that monopoly. In addition, the discussion can be strengthened if the Caribbean is brought into the picture. From 1847 until the early 1870s, we know that there was a huge influx of Chinese coolies into Cuba, mediated by the British state, as well as by labor brokers in Havana, London, Macau, Amoy, and Manila. The coolies were meant to augment and eventually replace black slave labor. In 1873, reports of abuses suffered by coolies prompted the Chinese government to send an imperial mission to investigate the living and working conditions of Chinese laborers, resulting in the Cuba Commission report. Looking at the situation in Manila with an eye to the Caribbean makes us better appreciate Dr. Galang's statement that in 1871, quote, Madrid responded that the new measures that Izquierdo had proposed had to conform with the provisions of the 1864 Sino-Spanish Treaty, especially on the most favored nation clause. This meant the fees, as we heard from Dr. Galang, that were being extracted from the transient Chinese had to be levied on all foreigners in the Philippines. It was a concession to the Chinese, although nothing is said about whether China or the Philippine Chinese had in fact filed a complaint on this issue. Madrid made a point of appeasing China. It would well have been in anticipation of an immigration treaty that Spain signed with China in 1877, in view of the fact that Cuba needed Chinese workers. In other words, Spain, as a middling European power, sought to comply with the 1864 treaty, cognizant of its interests in both the Philippines and Cuba. And Dr. Galang is aware of this fact, and it can be highlighted more explicitly in the paper. Back in Manila, the measure resulted in the possibility of better surveillance of the Chinese, as Dr. Galang has emphasized. The Chinese thereby had to register at the national, provincial, and municipal levels of government regularly. They had to possess documents of identification when residing in, traveling within, or leaving the colony. It was both a fiscal and security measure by the Spanish colonial state. It would be interesting to know whether, in fact, this security measure was applied not just to the Chinese, but to the Germans, other Europeans, and Americans coming into the Philippines. The second case concerns the direct importation of Chinese coolies to work in a German tobacco plantation in Jolo, Sulu. Consistent with Izquierdo's policy, Governor General Valeriano Weyler issued a decree in September 1888 that required all Chinese coming to the Philippines to, quote, first register at the port of Manila, before traveling to other parts of the archipelago, unquote. The decree was meant to prevent the entry of undocumented Chinese through the back door in Sulu. Note, however, that Zamboanga, whose port had been opened since 1855, was not considered as a point of entry. And in fact, Philippine natives were being hired as seafarers on foreign vessels directly out of Zamboanga. In any event, the requisite registration in Manila increased the costs incurred by the German company. The German ambassador in Spain complained that Weyler's 1888 decree was contrary to Article 10 of the 1864 Sino-Spanish Treaty. In 1890, Madrid decided that the German ambassador's complaint had no merit. To further appreciate this decision, we need to look at, in fact, Spanish relations with Germany, not just the Sino-Spanish Treaty. In fact, on the 30th of May in 1877, there was a protocol of Sulu between Spain, Germany, and Great Britain. We need to know what happened between 1877 and 1890, for now Spain was able to rebuff Germany. The third case deals with the 1893 protocol of the colonial government in Manila to increase the entry fee of newly arrived Chinese immigrants from 10 to 20 pesos. In December 1894, the Chinese ambassador to Spain, acting specifically on behalf of the Chinese community in Manila, filed a complaint stating that the doubling of the landing fee was a violation of the 1864 Sino-Spanish Treaty. In March 1896, Madrid informed Governor General Ramon Blanco that the proposed measure was indeed in contravention of the 1864 treaty. In these three cases, Madrid's decision suggested that Spain sought to comply with the treaty, but we need to understand other factors that were also at play. We need to situate these decisions in a wider framework for us to appreciate Izquierdo's, for how Madrid actually forced Izquierdo to expand his proposed measure, why Madrid negated Blanco's proposal, and why Madrid rebuffed the German ambassador. I wonder, however, why the 1864 treaty did not seem to matter when the cedula tax system was implemented in the late 19th century. In 1889, the Cédula de Capitación Personal was promulgated for the Chinese. In February 1890, it was imposed on all Chinese regardless of age. When all the surcharges were included, the cedula for the Chinese was much higher than the equivalent cedula for different tax categories applicable to natives, Spaniards, and all other foreigners. In this case, there was no favored nation status. But as Wickberg observed, quote, the real squeeze was at the top, on the top 10% of the Chinese community that was self-employed or had their own businesses. In this light, the Gremio de Chinos, quote, according to Wickberg, filed protests against the anti-Chinese acts of the 1880s and 1890s. Now, I wonder, was the 1864 treaty ever invoked in these complaints? Did these protests ever reach Madrid? At the end of the day, the 1864 Sino-Spanish Treaty must be understood, I think, in relation to the highly ambivalent place of the Chinese in the Spanish Philippine society, as already signaled by Dr. Chu. This situation in the Philippines did not exist in Cuba and Puerto Rico, and certainly not in Madrid or in Spain. The Chinese in the Philippines were foreigners with fluid immigration practices, yet were allowed to have their own Gremio de Chinos, which other foreigners did not have. Although non-natives, the Chinese for many centuries had been compelled to render compulsory labor, which they were also forced to redeem through cash payment. There were special laws that applied to them that did not apply to natives and other foreigners. It is this indeterminate and slippery position of the Chinese in the Spanish Philippines that the 1864 treaty tried to recognize but also disregard. The treaty protected Chinese merchants as though they were itinerant, even though there was a highly settled Chinese population that engaged in circular migration between China and the Philippines. Yet when the treaty was applied, it concerned not merchants, but coolies, drifters, and the undocumented. The treaty negotiators appeared oblivious to the liminal, shifting, yet also permanent place of the Chinese in the Spanish Philippines. The 1864 treaty used words on paper to encode fixed state interests amid the elusive reality of mobile and sedimented Chinese bodies. We need to take these basic disjunctures into account in attempting to understand how the treaty was applied and not applied to specific cases on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aguilar. Maybe we can give 1 minute na lang for response from Dr. Galang so that we can start the next one on time then.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Aguilar and Dr. Chu, for those very insightful comments. I know when I submitted the paper to Confucius Institute, I know that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Thank you for all the comments. I took note of all of them, and I hope to revise the paper based on the suggestions that you gave. I agree with the suggestions and the comments that Dr. Chu and Dr. Aguilar gave, specifically on how to look at the 1864 treaty in a broader context. So hopefully I'll be able to get more materials to incorporate in the present version of the paper. So maraming salamat po, Dr. Chu and Dr. Aguilar.
Thank you, Dr. Galang. Thank you to our discussants. Our final paper for this morning session, will be presented. Is authored by 4 people. By the way, you can extend maybe this last session for a little bit since it's going to be the lunchtime anyway. So, the first author is João Paulo Reginaldo. He graduated from UP Baguio with a degree in social science, history, and political science. He's currently teaching history at the University of the Philippines, Baguio. The second author is Precious Maecah Ratay, currently a Master of Arts in History student at UP Diliman, and junior faculty member of Division of Social Sciences, UP Visayas. Her research interests include religious history and local history. The third one is Jeraiah Gray. She finished her BA in Social Sciences with a major in history at the University of the Philippines, Baguio. She now teaches there as an instructor in history. Her research interests include urbanism and scales of place that have enmeshed Philippine cities across different periods in history. And finally, the presenter of this paper is Ruchie Mark Pototanon. He has a BA major in sociology and history from the University of the Philippines, Visayas, and an MA in history from UP Diliman. He was formerly an assistant professor of history at UP Visayas and an incoming PhD student at the Asia Research Center, Murdoch University. And the discussants for this paper are, first, Dr. Ambeth Ocampo. He's a Filipino historian whose research covers the 19th century Philippines. He writes Looking Back, a widely read editorial page column for the Philippine Daily Inquirer, and has published over 30 books. He is also professor and former chair of the History Dep of Ateneo, and he has served as the chairman of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines. And the second discussant will be Dr. Fernando Zialcita. He obtained his BA Humanities and MA Philosophy at the Ateneo de Manila University, and another MA and his PhD in Cultural Anthropology at the University of Hawaii. He is Professor Emeritus at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology of Ateneo and heads the Cultural Heritage Studies program. He emphasizes the importance of food as an accessible, lived experience that communicates how indigenous Chinese, Spanish, and Mexican influences fuse together to a distinct flavor. And now let us welcome Mr. Ruchie Pototanon to present the paper.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Since my internet connection is quite bad, I made a recording earlier, so I would like to ask a member of my research team, Miss Jeraiah Gray, to play the recording that I had earlier. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes, please, sir. I'm about to play it now, and please tell me po if there's no audio. Thank you.
Together with the Good morning, everyone. This is Ruchie
Yes, we can hear it.
from
Okay po.
Now it's gone. I can't hear anything right now. Also, can you increase the volume a bit?
Okay po. Very sorry about that. Let me try again. It seems our internet connection today is a little intermittent.
Yeah. So I think I can talk over the parts that doesn't have the audio.
Or maybe you
That's
can
the
also
case.
send it to Stephanie, the file, if you can send it.
Okay.
Para we have another one.
Okay.
Sige po.
So just to start, so our paper is Trails of Taste. It's the study of the food exchange between Manila and Fujian. So there's actually 4 of us in this study. All of us are junior academics. So it's really our first project together, and perhaps even our first project as individuals. Okay.
Sir Ruchie, should I try to play it again?
Yeah, sure.
Okay po.
Good morning, everyone. This is
Okay.
Ruchie
Okay, thank you.
Pototanon, formerly from the University of the Philippines, Visayas. Today I will be presenting the output of our research project together with Jeraiah Gray, Paulo Reginaldo of University of the Philippines, Baguio, and Maecah Ratay from the University of the Philippines. So our research project is titled Trails of Taste, Manila Fujian Food Exchange in the Age of the Galleons. So background. So the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade has from 1565 to 1815 restructured Asian and West European economies. And the changes that it has brought in a culture and economy has been far-reaching beyond its time where it existed. So Manila and Fujian, especially the cities of Xiamen and Chuanzhou, became important trading posts for high-value goods like silk and porcelain. And the Fujian, especially the city of Chuanzhou, has been the source of majority of Chinese descendants in the Philippines. So there is a need to reorient the galleon trade era as a period by focusing on Manila Fujian interactions in terms of food culture. So that is why we started this project, because mostly it looks at the exchange between Manila and Acapulco, but part of this larger trade network is the Manila Fujian exchange. Okay, so if you're going to look at here in the map, so these are the areas that we will be discussing mostly. Fujian province. So here's Fujian province in southeastern China. But the focus of the study would be the people called within the south, that's the southern Min or the Minnan people, or what they call themselves the Lanang, which have their hometown in cities of Chuanzhou, Changzhou, and Amoy in the Fujian province. So they have strong connections overseas, not only in the Philippines, but also in Southeast Asia, and later on also to other parts of the world where they would migrate. So this is so the connection between Fujian and Luzon is seen in this 17th century Selden map, in which in this map Luzon is included in the map of southern China. So what are the objectives and methodology of this project? So this project tries to examine the trade of agricultural and food products between Fujian province and Manila during the first half of the Spanish colonial period, when the galleon trade defined a global network of exchange between Spanish territories in the New World and China. Second, to provide a more nuanced understanding of the China-Manila trade leg as it led to cultural exchanges prompted by the entries of agricultural and food products when investigating the kind of food and agricultural products traded between China and the Philippines and the ways these products are adapted into local food cultures. This study was conducted through digital archival research and a bit of field work in Binondo. So while we had some initial difficulties, especially at looking at the China-Manila trade, because most of colonial history, this is a form of illicit trade. So the imperial government, the Chinese imperial government, or the Chinese empire actually does not sanction this kind of trade between Fujian and Manila. So our primary sources would include, of course, documents, translated documents, in particular, we use the Hokkien Spanish historical document, the Diccionario Hispanico-Sinicum, which was translated into English, which was transcribed or reprinted. And then also documents from the Spanish archives. So this is the cover of the Hokkien Spanish of the Diccionario Hispanico-Sinicum. So even before the galleon trades, there's a connection between southern China and southern China or Fujian and Philippines. So what would become as Philippines. So southern Chinese has foodways that are different from the northern Chinese. So usually there would be distinction between northern Chinese food and southern Chinese food, and the line of distinction would be usually the Yangtze River. So their food, the southern Chinese food, is sometimes closely more similar to Southeast Asian. Like for example, the dominance of rice over cereals over other cereals such as millet, sorghum, and wheat, and the use of taro, yam, galangal, sago, which are very Southeast, which has been recorded as early as the Tang Dynasty in southern China, and also dishes with frogs and livestock entrails, so which is common in Filipino food. So this is not very common in the north. So cities of Fujian and especially Quanzhou had long trade with people of the southern seas, which continued in spite of imperial restrictions, so mostly sea bans. So Quanzhou, majority, almost 90% of the Chinese in the Philippines could trace their descent from the city of Quanzhou. So Manila was an important part of the 1100 to 1600 Taiwan Luzon trade route from Fujian, and pre-Hispanic rulers in the Philippines engaged in tribute missions to China. So the Fujian Chinese are carriers of trade and culture. Hokkien merchants, mostly from Quanzhou and Changzhou prefectures in the south, these are the people who compose the bulk of the Sangles, or the Chinese traders. So Hokkien's Sangles from Anhai were usually called the well-to-do merchants in Manila, and we would be called known as Anayes. Bakers, butchers, and other tradespeople would find work in Manila through the network of mutual alliance, which would be familial, guild-based, merchant-based, or fictive kinship networks. So throughout the Galleon era, the center for Chinese activity were the Alcaceria, the silk market, and the Parian. This is a center of trade for all Chinese goods that entered Manila, especially the food items imported from overseas, fruits, wheat, dried meat. So Chinese bakers initially using Chinese flour critical to feeding intramuros, and brought their versions of bread to the population, contributing to the food culture at the time. So this is the early colonial period in which China actually exports food to the Philippines. Meanwhile, as we proceed to the Galleon era, not only that China would export products that are listed on the left, but the Philippines would, because of the Galleon trade, because of the Columbian exchange, would have products coming from the New World being introduced into China. So aside from those, commonly mentioned in the product produced in the Philippines, just the bird's nest, the sea cucumber, and the rice, there you have new new crops that are being that are probably sent to China, like peanuts, sweet potato, white potato, tomato, corn, maize, chili pepper, yam bean or jicama, cassava, manioc, squash, chayote, guava, papaya, cherimoya, sweet soup, sour soup, sapote, and pineapple. So these not only um, add to the repertoire of food plants in the Philippines, but also it spread towards China, as we will show later on, and towards southern China of Fujian, especially for example, Fujian is considered to be the area in which certain crops like sweet potato, white potato, and maize were first introduced. So sweet potato as early as in the 1590s is being seen as a famine food. It was able to save the city of Pizhou from a famine. Okay, so as these foreign products were exchanged or were brought to China, they would take new names. Like the peanut would be called in Chinese Sheng, but important to look here are the names for certain plants like sweet potato, which is also called as fanshu, which means barbarian tuber. And also in Hokkien, the word han was also retained. While tomato was called fanxie, which means, sorry for my my pronunciation of Chinese words if it's wrong. Hokkien tomato was called as foreign eggplant in Chinese. So yeah, interestingly, many of the words were not the name, unlike in the Philippines, in which the names of the words were retained in were adapted from Nawa. The Chinese, when they these crops, when they were brought to China, they took on new names. So and still you see from these are entries from the Chinese, the Dictionario Sinicum, and you see that there would be entries on nido, on noodles, okay. And what would happen after the galleons? Okay, so the country, the Philippines, continued to export rice to China, and the opening of provincial ports such as Insual contributed to this continuity. So most of the activity after the galleon trade continued, and actually it somehow increased because there is more openness on the part of the Philippines as a Spanish colony. But of course, the illicit part of the trade from Manila to Fujian still exists. So going straight into the present, okay. So this food exchange has resulted to the creation of particular recipes that is not just widespread in the Philippines but also in Southeast Asia. So and this is best exemplified, I would like to say, by fresh lumpia or the lumpia. So the Philippine variation of lumpia from the restaurant in Poland and Binondo integrates ingredients like peanuts from the Americas, one soy lettuce, ground seaweed, which is called enoki na saute, and fried ground noodles. And if you're going to look at recipes all over Southeast Asia and even in America for this food, you would find that it has peanuts. So it has peanuts, it has this hoti, it has this fried ground noodles, and of course it has a wrapper. So this was you could say that this was actually a product of the exchanges during the galleon trade, because the peanut was introduced to China during the galleon era. Okay. So conclusion. So food exchanges transformed both the foodways of Fujian and Manila. So Chinese Filipino food shows strong Fujianese influence. And Fujianese cuisine all over the world was transformed by the arrival of new food plants from the New World via Manila. For example, is popia or lumpia. So before I forget, aside from peanuts also, another New World ingredient that is usually integrated in popia or lumpia is hikama, or the yam bean, or in Tagalog, singkamas. So the introduction of food plants from the Americas also changed the foodways of the whole of China. Crops such as peanuts, sweet potatoes, white potatoes, and corn became imported foodstuffs and superseded native crops. As early as the 20th century, corn has superseded native grains such as sorghum and millet in their consumption in northern China. Sweet potatoes have become a very important calamity food, not just in southern China, because the food the Fujianese would have it with their porridge, but also in northern China. White potatoes. So there's actually a study in which it shows that 90% of the poorest counties in China subsist on white potatoes. And white potatoes was very important in lands that do not have irrigation or are very mountainous, because it provides them a source of starch. So and even like not just corn itself, like cornstarch, like most Chinese recipes now require cornstarch. And peanuts have become the most important source of nut oil, superseding other sources like rapeseed. Okay. So of course, this research project was not without challenges. So number one, we had with trouble access to translated references and cover materials on the Fujian and Manila sides of the trade, because this is an illicit trade to begin with. So dispatches are very few. Okay. So dearth of primary source materials and food waste during the agrarian era mostly are secondary sources. So adjustment also to remote learning and research strategies. But of course, we will not be able to do this research if not for the generous help of these people. So special thanks to Dr. Jely Galang, Dr. Cristel Abispado, Dr. Regalado Jose, Professor Elsie Malior, Redentor Salonga, Ivan Mandi, and Pastor Nathan Yu for their insights and assistance in making this project possible. And to Confucius Institute at Ateneo de Manila University for funding and support. So, Dosya, maraming salamat, salamat nga abo, agyamanak. Thank you very much. Here are our references.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Pototanon and the rest of the group. Now let's invite our first discussant, Dr. Ambeth Ocampo. You'll have 10 minutes to discuss the paper.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
There's not much to say because the speakers have said a lot of it already. Their paper was an interesting read, especially now in the beginning of my class. The first assignment my students do is to write a one-page paper on food from their childhood. And while writing that, I mean, yesterday we were processing what it was, and we were talking about, you know, what it is that makes their childhood food memorable. And I said, is it really the food itself, the taste, or is it a memory of that food? You cannot replicate food that you ate 20 years ago, but there is a memory of it. And this resonated in their paper about taste ways. I've taken the Ivan D. Eating tour too. We could not even eat. He gave us the full tour, so we couldn't eat by the time we got to the 10th restaurant. But Chinatown has always been interesting to me, simply because it's not well studied. And I started going through Chinatown simply because I was following Jose Rizal's Noli Me Tangere. If you open the first chapters, you can actually follow Ibarra as he walks around Binondo. He describes the smells that he sees. He looks at landmarks. And when I was walking along Ongpin and Santo Rosario, the Binondo Church, you will see that although the the city has changed a lot, the main layout of the city remains the same, and many of the things that he describes, sights, smells, are still there. So the point here in this paper is that we follow the trail of taste, and the paper is actually, well, when I was reading it, it's already your first chapter in a dissertation, because it is a wonderful and very compact survey of related literature. So for us, my generation who grew up with Doreen Fernandez and culinary culture, you can see actually from the paper that there has been a lot of research done, and most of these unfortunately are found in journals or periodicals. And it is great because of the pandemic that online we have been able to source most of this and download them. The paper readers were able to do a lot of material from Spanish sources, and I'd like to think that that dictionary in UST deserves to be given more research, because it is wonderful. It is significant, not just for us but also for Chinese material itself. The only thing that is lacking in the paper is actually something on the Chinese sources, and for that, I guess most of us are limited because of the barrier of language. I noticed that you had many documents from Sevilla which are available online, but I'm almost sure that if you go to Sevilla physically, you will find much more than they have actually uploaded. The other thing, since we're talking of the galleon trade, which is not online actually, is to go to the Mexican archives, because when I was in Mexico, I found that they had galleon lists, they had galleon supplies in many different sources. So just by looking at the packing lists, one can actually see physically what this exchange is like. Then there's also the question of the Spanish in Manila tried to control prices, and in Sevilla there are the lists of the controlled prices that they did in Manila for meat, for vegetable, and through these lists actually we can actually try to see what food was available in Manila from the 16th century when these lists were first gotten out. I've mentioned it in my book on money, because it gives you not only the prices but also what these foods are like. Going through their paper too, I was very interested in the illustrations. Part of history is actually trying to get as close as you can to the past, and I'm glad they actually used the Boxer Codex illustration of the galleon. When I first saw this in Charles Boxer's house, I was surprised because all the things that we knew about were those pictures of the Pinoys in their costumes, and I saw this fold-out thing. Although it's not the Philippines, it's Guam. It shows you how the galleon trade was doing in that early stage when it was barter. The illustration from Sevilla about the 1756 Parian is quite interesting, because you see the physical layout of the market, which looks like a Chinese bagua, and we don't know if that was done on purpose or if the Chinese have done that, but it actually shows us again how foreign influence is inculturated, how it comes in, and how we make it our own. So I'd like to think that this work points us into further research, and it will deepen not only the research into the galleon trade, but more importantly, it is a paper that gets us to see ourselves. I mean, we always look at the past as, it's like the Pinoys are this empty vessel and foreign influences come in. But what has been coming out in papers like this is to show that there was a base culture, and we were not as barren or empty as most people would like to think, but we have actually made some things our own. So like I like the example of the piaya, which is actually a flat hopyak. it shows you how they took in something from outside and made it distinctly our own. Or like say when we talk about Pancit Canton, which does not exist in Canton at all, how these things actually have been made Philippine. So it is Chinese, of Chinese origin, but it is also Philippine. One other thing I wish that maybe they can look at, it's of course it's not your paper, but there's a lot of literature also on the Japanese trade. One of the offshoots of the galleon trade was also Japan, which is why the Japanese wanted, to get some part of this trade. And I've seen many papers about, Jesuits sending fruit trees from Manila to Japan. No, so there are certain fruits that were introduced to Japan from Manila. They sent birds, they sent insects. So this whole network shows us how important the galleon trade is. And it is more important than we have learned about it in school. It is something that shows us really that the first globalization actually happened in the galleon trade. I look forward to reading more of this group's paper, especially when the pandemic has closed and we are actually able to go back into the archives and find more material than is already been presented. Thank you and good morning.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ocampo.
Thank you very much. Next up, let's invite Dr. Zialcita to provide his thoughts on the paper.
Morning. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, the Confucius Institute, for organizing this wonderful conference. And I would like to congratulate the team, Ruchie, Precious, João, and Jeraiah, for putting together a paper that makes use of sources that are not usually utilized in writings on Philippine food. So it provided a lot of fresh insights. I was excited particularly by the fact that you're focusing on just one province in China, Fujian, rather than talking about China in general. Now, here are some points I wanted to raise. One reason I like the paper is because when food writers talk about Chinese influence in the Philippines, they tend to imagine that it has always been there, instead of realizing that it began at a point in time. And the point in time precisely is the galleon trade, when Chinese migration to Manila specifically jumped overnight between 1571 and the 1600s. From 50 Chinese settlers in Soliman's Manila to over 20,000 by the 1600s. I mean, that has to be taken into account when we consider our food culture. It hasn't always been there. So this has a specific beginning. Now, having said that, I think it would also be good to examine some of the points raised about Fujian. You pointed out actually that before the Han Chinese spread southwards, that Fujian was Austronesian, because after all, the Yue people, of which the Vietnamese are an example, were Austronesian. I think it might be good to examine that assumption, because as far as I know, the Vietnamese, like the Cambodians, are not Austronesian, they're Austroasiatic, because there are actually 3 language groups in Southeast Asia, which began in Yunnan, which are interrelated but are now different from each other. One is Austronesian, to which Filipinos, Indonesians, and Malays belong. The other one is Austroasiatic, to which the Vietnamese and the Cambodians belong. And the third is Thai Kadai, they also, which has Thai and Lao. As far as I know, according to linguistic scholars like Robert Blues, they have one stem, and one root, which began apparently in Yunnan. But then it diverged, and the Austronesians spread from southern China, Fujian, to Taiwan. But I think you have to be more precise in what you mean, because I think you have to take into account the Austroasiatics. Very different. It's a different language group. Now, of course, these three language families still share basic similarities, like they all build houses on stilts, and bilateral kinship is a common denominator among these three language families. But I think you have to be more precise about that. Now, I like the emphasis on Fujian, but I think I would have wanted a bit more emphasis on cooking styles. Yeah, you talked about the use of certain vegetables that are found in Fujian, not found in the Philippines. You mentioned cooking styles in Fujian, cooking styles in the pre-Hispanic Philippines. But when you actually came to colonial Philippines, I could not see how the Philippine cooking style was actually altered. The subject of Chinese food in the Philippines is always a delightful one. The other day, I went to Quiapo, and I brought home with me hopia from Kim Chon Tea, hopia with black bean, and hopia with salted egg and mongo. It was a wonderful surprise for my family because they love hopia. Now, but what's interesting there is that it has the hopia has salted egg, which I don't know. I don't think is found in Fujian, but it's a development in the Philippines that that shows that yes, there were the Hokkien people brought in their ways, but the new environment transformed what they brought in, as Dr. Ocampo pointed out. So it would be nice actually to discuss more the cooking ways. I don't know, that might be the subject for another paper, but you see, when I was reading your paper earlier, I thought you would discuss that. And in fact, the last part, when you talk about your exploration of Chinatown, I thought that there would be an exploration of that. So I would have. So you mentioned the fact that the Hokkien people like they like to use root crops. They like frogs. They like herbs that are found in Southeast Asia. But how about the cooking style? Like this idea of making hopia, is that found in other parts of China, and how did that change when they came to the Philippines? You mentioned also pancit. I mean, what is the what is the Hokkien style of making pancit, and how was it altered when they came to the Philippines? Because we know noodles are universal in China, but what is the Hokkien style of doing it? That is what I would have wanted to find out. The parallel I find is with the Chinese familial terms that we now use in the Philippines, like ate and kuya. A Chinese Filipino student of ours in anthropology, Mark Ong, who's conversant in both Mandarin and Hokkien, was telling me that actually the word kuya, which denotes in the Philippines, in Tagalog, elder brother, is actually not found in standard Hokkien. The word is koya, which simply means an old man. So it's a Philippinized Hokkien that we're actually using in familiar terms. So it would be nice to see whether there's such a parallel in Hokkien influences on Chinese food. Okay, now another thing I wanted to point out is you pointed that that our indigenous ancestors had a wonderful partnership with the ecosystem. I think we have to be careful about such assertions that I know they're very common right now because of the ecological crisis, but anthropologists have cautioned that just because they did not have our tools for exploiting the environment does not mean that they were not exploitative in some way or the other. Because it's interesting to know that actually the horse was widespread in pre-Hispanic Philippines. So what happened to the horse? How come it disappeared? Was it hunted to extinction? So we cannot simply assume that. And also I noticed that section was not, you just made an assertion, two or three paragraphs, which were not actually substantiated by any source. Yeah. So basically, yeah. Another thing you might like to explore is actually the interface between products coming from the Philippines and the New World and Fujianese cooking. That there was a big gap there because I remember Ivan Mandi introduced me to kiampoy, which is standard Fujianese food in Chinatown. And I was intrigued by the fact that kiampoy sums up perfectly the situation in Fujian. In other words, it is rice indeed, but it has peanuts and kamote. It is a response actually indeed to disasters because kamote makes up the bulk of kiampoy and peanuts are easy to grow. So I would have wanted a discussion like that just to tie your different strands together. I guess with that is all I have to say. Congratulations again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zialcita, and thank you very much to our presenter and authors for this last paper. The next portion is our break. Okay, finally we can have our lunchtime. But first, I will just announce that our speaker for this afternoon, Miss Rina, what's her name? Boconanon. I'm sorry. Boncocan. Miss Rina Boncocan will unfortunately not be able to be present this afternoon. In her place, the person who will present her paper will be Mr. Christian Sulmayor. Okay, so thank you again for joining us for this morning session. I'll turn over to Sophia.
Thank you so much, Sir Chris, to our presenters, discussants, and participants for the morning session. Before we conclude this session, may I request everyone to please turn on your cameras for our picture taking. Kindly turn on your cameras. I'll give you a few seconds more. Okay, we are still waiting for some, but I'll start taking a photo now. Okay, 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay, let me take another one. 1, 2, 3, smile. Thank you so much, everyone. We will be having a 1-hour break and we'll be back for the afternoon session by 1 p.m. Thank you so much.